A Nobel laureate economist claims the Iraq war is costing the U.S. $3 trillion. Yet President Bush argues the war spending is helping the economy. Profit or loss, how is the war bill adding up? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Sami Zaidan. A new book claims the Iraq war will cost the United States at least $3 trillion. The estimate, just days before the 5th anniversary of the invasion, comes from Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz and his co-author, Harvard professor Linda Bilmes. Well, their figure includes the long-term cost of caring for veterans and their dependents. And they say it's conservative. Well, the Pentagon, of course, disputes the claim, putting the cost of the war just over $400 billion to the end of December last year. But the authors maintain what they call reckless war financing is seriously weakening the U.S. economy. They conclude, while the harm Bush's war has inflicted on the people of Iraq is visible in the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives and a destroyed country, the damage to our own is just becoming clearer. Well, $3 trillion is a lot of money, but what else could it buy? Well, according to the author's calculations, $3 trillion could pay the salaries of 45 million teachers in the United States, or subsidize a year of health care for more than 1.5 billion children. That same $3 trillion could also be spent on 24 million housing units or university education for 129 million students. Well, joining our discussion today, our guests in Washington, D.C., political consultant and Republican strategist Jack Berkman. Also in Washington, D.C., Phyllis Bennis, director of the New Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies. And in London, Salah Hashimi, a writer and member of the Iraqi League in the United Kingdom. Thank you all for being with us. I want to start with Phyllis. Why is the Iraq war proving so costly, according to estimates, second only to World War II?
You know, the figures that came out in the Stiglitz-Bilmes article have been quite shocking for people in this country, partly because we've been told a very different set of figures. We've been told that the war, President Bush has said that the war has cost so far only $400 billion. In fact, there's actually been more than $550 billion already spent. But aside from that, there are many, many hidden costs that are simply not made public. For example, the cost of taking care of veterans is being only partly acknowledged. The only veterans' deaths that are included in the statistics that are publicly displayed by the Pentagon are combat troops who are killed in combat. That's only about 1/3 of the actual deaths of military people in Iraq. The others, if they're killed in a training accident, in a plane crash, diseases that they're picking up in this very toxic environment, are not included. Right. The same for the wounded. So all of that is hidden and is not being acknowledged. The figure $3 trillion is actually quite conservative. It does not include, for example, the almost $1 billion that the economists estimate will be the lost production in the United States. It does include almost $1 billion. It's about $893 billion, almost $1 trillion in interest on the loans. This war has been fought on a credit card. It's been fought without raising taxes, particularly on the rich, and it's allowed the government to
I'm going to jump in there if I could,
the
Phyllis, because we'll get more into sort of the future prospects of what future generations may have to carry out of this war. We can go over to Jack Berkman. The figures that we're talking about sound shocking. Should we be shocked?
Well, I think Phyllis is shocking us with a lot of projections. I mean, I think the $400 billion, I mean, even if you double that and take it to $800 billion, let me say something controversial. It's not a lot of money for an economy like this. I mean, the guns versus butter argument is an old argument, and you can always say, look what we could do if we didn't have guns. We could have all this butter. We could have education. Well, if the U.S. had taken that view for 200 years, we wouldn't be leading the world, because there's a time when you have to fight. If you want to be Rome, if you want to be Britain, if you want to be the U.S., there's a time when you have to fight. I just think that, you know, but more than that, if you look at the way we spend money today, the Pentagon spends it more efficiently than ever because we outsource. About 90% of U.S. DoD budget is contractors. It's Lockheed Martin, it's General Dynamics, it's Raytheon. So there's a ripple effect in the economy. Phyllis is talking about the negative. There's the positive. We hire more, you know, the defense industry is a big sector of the economy. You know, let's face it, it creates jobs. Maybe it's controversial to say that. I mean, war is certainly not a money-making operation, but the losses financially aren't as great as Phyllis is saying. The real tragedy here is that the U.S. has to bear the cost of global security, of collective security on its own. The tragedy is that the Europeans, the Canadians, these people pay, the Japanese, they pay none of the bill of collective security in the world. And I think the next president, if it's McCain, I think he has to take a very harsh line with the free riders and let them know.
You've mentioned a number of issues there, Jack. If I could jump in, I want to pick up on one of them and take it back to Phyllis. The idea of these figures that we're looking at, are they really that big, that shocking, when we put them in the context of the US GDP, which some say adds to no more than 3% of GDP?
They are huge, even in an economy the size of the United States. I mean, I found it interesting that Jack speaks glowingly of if you want to be Rome. This is the U.S. acting like an empire. This was a war that was fought for choice. This is not a war that is helping the economy. If you define the economy as war profiteers, particularly the CEOs of those companies, much more than the workers, CEO bonuses and pay has grown over 70% in the last 10 years. Workers' pay less than 7%. So let's be clear who benefits from that kind of war profiteering.
I didn't say we're making money. We're not making money off the war.
Excuse me, let me just finish. Even if we are certainly not making money off the war, and it's the people first of Iraq, but secondly, people in this country whose children, grandchildren, and now great and great-great-grandchildren are going to be paying for the cost of this war.
We will talk later on in part 2 more about those aspects of who exactly is benefiting from the war in Iraq. But if we could bring in an Iraqi into this discussion, Salah Hashimi, we shouldn't forget that Iraqis are suffering too, aren't they, from this war? What sort of financial prospects are they facing?
Well, the damage done to the Iraqi people is in fact disproportionate. With interest, I followed your guest's comment in that the fight that the America has taken to Iraq had to be fought. His exact words were, "You have to fight." Well, in fact, in this war, they did not have to, because the entire grounds on which the war was fought turned out to be a fallacy. There were no weapons of mass destruction, and Iraq did not pose any threat to America or to its neighbors at that time. Let me recall the words of a very famous Greek tragic dramatist who, back in 525 BC, wrote the following: "Truth is the first casualty of war." In fact, this has been resurrected in today's Iraq war.
That's looking backwards, Salah, but if we could look forwards and talk about the situation now. Well, tell us a little bit about the suffering, the debts, the displaced people who've lost their breadwinners in Iraq. What sort of situation are they facing?
Well, in fact, the direct consequence of that war was the loss of security. The loss of security has a dramatic impact on the people of Iraq. There is dramatic forced migration all over the country. People have escaped Iraq to neighboring countries. They have lost the male members of their families, who are effectively the breadwinners. They have been forced to flee into Europe to seek sanctuary.
Well, so you would, let me ask you this. So you would rather live under Saddam? In other words, so you had a brutal dictator that killed millions. Did you want to just keep living under Saddam for 20 years? Did you like that system?
I don't know where you got the figure millions from, really. We have to be accurate.
But I mean, did you want to live under Saddam? Did you? But what I'm saying is, you're making.
Excuse me, can we hear from an
Okay,
Iraqi on the program, please, Jack?
All right, I want to jump in at this point. Let's perhaps not get too bogged down into the history, because we could go on discussing that forever. And let's try and focus on the issue of this episode. And Jack Berkman, I mean, one of the points which Phyllis raised is the fact that the Bush administration is borrowing money. It's fighting a war on credit. Is it setting up future administrations and future generations to carry the true bill of this war, which perhaps we haven't really seen yet?
Well, the U.S. is living on credit generally, and the U.S. government spends too much money. My only point is that the war is not costing as much financially as people say, people like Phyllis say, because of this multiplier effect, because of we have the ripple effect. with the effective outsourcing of the Pentagon. Are we making a profit from it? No. But the losses, because you're pumping that money back into the economy in an efficient way that we didn't do before and that other countries don't do with their military, mitigates the losses. It mitigates some of these costs. The other thing is, your Iraqi guest is making an absurd argument. He's arguing now that the Iraqis are worse off than they were under Saddam. He's afraid to come out and say that, but that's the thrust of what he's arguing.
All right, let's pick up on some of those points, first of all, with Phyllis. Yeah, I can see, Phyllis, you really want to get into this. I'll let you have a quick rebuttal.
Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, that it ill behooves Jack to be telling Iraqis what is absurd for them to look at the security situation under which they lived now, under Saddam Hussein, during the years that the U.S. was backing Saddam Hussein, during any of those periods. It's not really our judgment call. We should look at the statistics of the State Department's own polls of Iraqis that indicate that 79% of Iraqis want the U.S. and British occupation troops out immediately. 61% of Iraqis say that it's acceptable to them. Excuse me, 61% of Iraqis today believe that it's acceptable to attack and kill coalition forces because they want them out so badly. So let's be clear where Iraqis stand and where we stand in this country. I think that Iraqis have the right to speak for themselves. What I'm citing is...
All right, I'm sorry.
Do you feel as
Jack, we could just let Phyllis finish her point, and then we'll come to you. Sorry.
We are talking here about the notion of what is efficient. I don't know what kind of statistic Jack is looking at, but when we are now paying low-ranking guards, often taken from the militaries, former militaries of Chile and South Africa who operated under the dictatorships of those countries, who are a large number of the guards hired by U.S. corporations like Blackwater and others, they are being paid up to $400,000 a year. Low-ranking U.S. soldiers doing the same work are paid $40,000 a year. I'm not sure how outsourcing is actually such a good idea.
All right,
are you advancing the argument? No.
Guys, we have plenty more to argue about, but it is time now for a short break. When we come back, we'll talk about the winners of the Iraq War and who's benefiting. Do stay with us.